Hi, everyone. This is SIG Multicluster meeting on October 24th. This is our first meeting on Zoom. This meeting is recorded, and part of the move to Zoom is to also help with the recording, which apparently is easier to handle than Hangouts. So to my knowledge on the agenda, from what I remember, maybe top of the order was discussion on that Jonathan's leading.
Yeah, on the cluster registry. I think Eric is here today. So if there are any questions or concerns about cluster registry auth that people had, we can discuss them. And then I think we can discuss the cluster registry project plan, which was put out last week or late the week before, I don't quite remember. And make sure that nobody has, if there are any concerns or major issues with it, that we can at least know about them in this meeting, and if not, then we can move forward with that plan more concretely.
Yeah, so I can chat a little bit about some of the cluster auth or the cluster registry auth use cases that at least I've been thinking about and discussing a bit with other people in the SIG. I did drop a link into the agenda notes describing a little bit of a proposal that we might explore. Unfortunately, Zoom doesn't support Wayland, so I can't share my screen. I would love to, but that link is definitely there, and I can go over a little bit about it. So basically, because of the cluster registry, awesome.
Oh.
Basically, because the cluster registry is such a convenient spot with lots of juicy metadata about where your clusters live, what auth providers they might support, how to log into their cluster, I think it is a really good candidate for possibly having some expedited methods in kubectl to understand this format, to read it, and bootstrap kubeconfigs in a very quick way. A really good example is just the fact that the clusters list have all of the information you would need to at least configure all of your server information. Here's the endpoints, here's the CA bundles, here's where they all live, maybe some additional metadata about whether or not, what stage they are, production, something, what cloud they're on. And it'd be really, really easy to just succinctly take that information and put it into a kubectl. So I think the biggest thing that I would argue is that if we move forward with the cluster registry and it finds more stabilization through betas and so on and so forth, that it would be a very interesting idea to have kubectl understand this natively and download them, and be able to download that information for the user. I think where it gets kind of both more interesting and a little bit more complicated is with this authentication info object that we have in the cluster registry, or that the proposal that the current API at least has. The cluster registry has this field called authinfo, and what its intent is to basically advertise public information about how to log into the cluster. This can be really useful for things like, okay, I want to know how to get a bearer token to talk to the Kubernetes API, or knowing what particular authentication or how to verify a token, possibly if you're something like the dashboard. And in this, I have a little bit of a straw man talking a little bit about how you might encode something like an OAuth 2 device flow. So if whoever's sharing can scroll down a little bit, this cluster info has this authinfo information. The name is just some arbitrary name I made up, but the config expresses things like, here's the public client ID, here's the device client ID that exists that we should use for this, used to trigger this flow. Here's the scopes you should request, here's the device auth URL that you should hit, and here's the CA bundle. And I think that expressing this kind of information could potentially lead to tools that could do something like kubectl or something, or some tool, and say log into this cluster and you could very quickly be prompted to go to a website, do some sort of OAuth dance with that website, log into the provider using a corporate identity or something like your GitHub OAuth ID, and then be authenticated against Kubernetes instantly, or have kubectl be authenticated against Kubernetes instantly, and bootstrapping very, very quickly. The little straw man I put down here at the bottom that's being displayed is the kubectl support. So we could very sort of quickly replicate things like a kubeadm join or OC login that sort of replicate this type of problem, taking something that has only bootstrapping credentials and turning that into real credentials, and try to replicate that where we point kubectl at a cluster registry, and then have it bootstrap all of the information that it needs to authenticate the user against the APIs and actually gain credentials for that user on that user's behalf. So there are some problems, I think, that I've tried to outline a little bit in this. Basically, it's going to be difficult for us to maybe talk about. There's actually a question right here that is, have I looked into plugin mechanisms for kubectl yet? So I think that plugins would be a good way of prototyping these type of things. The problem is that if you're going to ship an additional binary with kubectl, you largely might as well just wrap kubectl and do these logins yourself. So I think that there are a lot of sort of proprietary mechanisms, like people who've not invented, but sort of have their own internal standards for how to log in. Maybe they're using a YubiKey, maybe something else, and they have specific endpoints that implement custom APIs for gaining other credentials. I think that those would be hard-pressed to put into something like kubectl, and a plugin mechanism or a wrapper around kubectl would be beneficial. I think that there is value in trying to create more endorsed upstream mechanisms that are standards, that are based on RFCs that are public and agreed upon, that express how to quickly bootstrap a generic kubectl. And that way we can start having more identity providers sort of aim for that. And I guess that is a little bit more contentious, and I don't want to distract from that, because I'll probably go have this conversation in SIG off, because there'll be lots and lots of feedback. But this is the basic sort of premise of what I see the auth info representing and how it potentially could be used. So yeah, I guess that's all I got for now. And the
reason that I asked that question is because, if I understand correctly, to implement what you describe, kubectl then has to know about our API group for cluster registry, right? Mm-hmm. And as far as I know, the goal is to eliminate code from kubectl and not to add references to things that aren't in main Kubernetes. I could be wrong. I think it might be worth a discussion with SIG CLI. Yeah. I think this is probably a new case that I haven't considered something of this form before. So it might be worth just talk in SIG CLI next time they meet to see what the reaction is.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. I had thought about that a little bit, but I didn't know if they had a hardline stance about it yet.
I mean, the other thing to consider is that implementing something as a plugin doesn't mean it doesn't have to ship with kubectl. Like, that's kind of a release thing versus a development thing. So maybe something can be developed, a plugin can happen in cluster registry, but as part of the release process, it can be bundled with kubectl and distributed that way.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't thought about that. Awesome.
Yeah, guys, we can move on. I mean, if there is nothing specific beyond this, I mean, I personally like this, what you're suggesting. And what I understand that cluster registry seems to be one point stuff which might be a place to discover cluster details and all that stuff. So it makes sense to have a native support in kubectl as Eric mentioned, might be for reference for everybody else. But I'm not sure if that's the best place to do it. I have my apprehensions about it.
Cool. Yeah, thank you very much, Eric. I really like the idea too. I think it sounds pretty interesting, but it definitely does sound like it needs to be taken up with SIG CLI to get some sense on their side if this is something that they would be in favor of and how they would recommend implementing it. Cool. In that case, I think we can move on and look at the cluster registry, discuss the cluster registry project plan. And I think, Irfan, are you presenting?
Yeah,
Can you pull?
Yes, I'll give, I'll stop the share and you can start the share.
Oh, thank you. Hold on. Give me a second to log in from here.
I can share the doc if you want me to, Jonathan.
I think that should be okay.
Yeah.
At some point, I will figure out which screen I'm sharing. Apparently not the right one.
I see the blank screen.
Do you see it now? Do you see the notes?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay. Cool. So I think everyone here has hopefully had a chance to read through this. If you haven't, I can give a quick overview. So the goal of this document is to lay out in sort of a high level detail some of the project, a plan for the cluster registry project for the next few quarters. Obviously, a lot of details here are left out in particulars, but I want to have a sort of a timeline and milestones for an alpha, beta, and a sort of a stable release of the cluster registry and define what things went into those. So down here at the bottom, we can see, I particularly address this, the milestones and timelines and the goals for each of those. The idea of I'd like an alpha to be out this quarter, which would in essence be a functional API server, a functional cluster registry API server with an alpha API that we've all agreed upon, enough documentation and ready for people to start trying out. And with the results of that, we can hopefully then move the API into beta, write some more tests, have better documentation. And once I think it's in a beta state, most of the work done to make it stable should be publishing the doc, making sure that we understand all of the particulars around having good documentation, making sure that the release process is very well set up, making sure that the ways that users are supposed to install it are very well understood and very well set up. I think there's been I haven't gotten much contention in the comments here. I think do people have particular questions about this or concerns with the timelines of the milestones or the contents of the milestones or anything around the processes that I've defined?
Resounding silence. So I think is that the silence of consent? I mean, I think our goal, or at least.
I have a couple of things I want to bring up, but go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, not at all. I think we're just asking for what people did want to bring up. We want to just keep barreling forward, and we don't see this as except for the auth corner. It looks like a lot of this is straightforward. So let's get the straightforward pieces behind us as soon as possible, and have as many people in the SIG able to participate and start mulling over code and learning about this together. That's kind of our intention right now.
Yeah, that is a good point. And I think one of the goals of this is if this comes out of this and is the SIG agrees with this plan, I intend to start making more milestones and prioritizing issues into this to hopefully make it easier for people to come in and actually contribute. Because I know that right now the repository, there's sort of a list of issues that don't have much prioritization or context. But I think with milestones in place, it would be easier for me to invite contributors to come in, and also for people who want to contribute to find something that they can work on. And I'd really like to get to that point soon.
Yep, that sounds cool. So I did go through the README that you have published at your place, Jonathan. Currently, I see that there are 3 contributors over there, right? I mean, 3 people are actively working on that.
Yeah, so there are currently 3 people who are contributing, or who have contributed PRs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So we spent some time reviewing the document, and we did have some things we wanted to bring up, as Paul was mentioning. Did we? Is that okay? Time to discuss that now?
That sounds good to me. We may take them offline later to finalize the discussion, because I don't want to spend necessarily the entire meeting discussing this, because there are other things. But please do bring them up.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ivan.
Sure. So one of the things that came up is the etcd implementation currently is being deployed with the cluster registry. Is that intending to be kind of a testing only strategy, or are there plans to actually just use the existing etcd, assuming you deploy that in an aggregated API model?
So the way that it is deployed today via the CRNet tool, that is intended to be a way that you could deploy it to production if you so desire, but it's not intended to be the canonical or only way to deploy it. The cluster registry is meant to also be usable as an aggregated API server, and to so be able to use the etcd instance. It should not depend on having its own etcd instance, though I believe aggregated API servers use their own etcd instances and not the master's etcd instance, generally. But that's not a requirement. It's more that is a convenience right now for deployment. And whatever etcd deployment model a user finds suitable, they should be able to do that with the cluster registry.
I would find it unlikely that a production scenario would deploy separate etcd instances per API, simply because the costs of having to ensure etcd reliability, like the number of nodes you require, that seems really onerous if you have n times the number of APIs. So you tend to use like just a prefix and use the same server.
It may depend on what the requirements in production you have for tenancy and security. As I understand it, etcd today doesn't have strong segmentation from users inside of one server. Or maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, Maru.
Well, I mean, when you're configuring it, you typically use a prefix, and
right.
The prefix governs everything that happens. So it's kind of, you're right, it's not super secure, but I mean, if you're deploying these servers, presumably you trust they're not going to access prefixes that they're not using.
So like I said, I think I agree with everything you just said about the cost with the item that I mean, the nice thing about this is we can let the users decide how they want to deploy it. It's decoupled from the implementation of the cluster registry. But I can see things going the other way too, that's all. etcds is still, in my mind, a little young in compared to just normal key value infrastructure. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So there is no intention that the cluster registry with its own etcd is the only way to deploy it. I think on my side, I didn't necessarily know what people's requirements would be for using the cluster registry. So I just hadn't gone and defined necessary deployment strategies other than using the kind of repurposing the already existing tool as a bootstrapping mechanism to get started with testing and to have something that people could use to start playing with it. But I think that is something that will come up in part of definitely in a beta or GA or stable phase, having documentation around what the actual requirements are for deploying a cluster registry, potentially having Helm charts that let you do different kinds of deployments, and just saying here's the container image, this is what it requires, set it up how you want. I think kind of a gradation of anything from run this command and you'll have one to play with to here's the container image, go configure it how you see fit, seems reasonable to me.
Okay. Yeah, if there was definitely opportunities to actually use the existing etcd in your Kubernetes, the Kubernetes core API server is using, I think that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, that's absolutely meant to be supported. And we can try and make sure that, we can make sure that it is supported. I don't see anything in the plan that would prevent that from working. But I think it's reasonable to make sure that it does work.
Okay. So we also had a couple others. If there aren't anything else people want to discuss about the etcd.
Go ahead.
We're also discussing the possibility of sort of the need for the CR-init tool versus just a Helm chart for deployment of the cluster registry. I know that we're kind of discussing it in the doc a little bit already. It does seem like perhaps the original reasons to have a binary deploy the cluster registry similar to the Federation control plane seems to be things that the existing Helm 2.7 does support. So Helm 2.7 was released yesterday, and it looks like there's support for generating TLS certificates and keys actually within the chart itself. It does also look like the service catalog deploys the API server using this mechanism. Or it doesn't use the existing functions yet, but it does deploy using the service hosts specified in the TLS certificate signing request. So I think that's something we should look at. I think there's enough support in the existing Helm to possibly move away from using a binary, only because it does add extra work to actually maintain the binary and deploy it and move it along. There is some work in maintaining a Helm chart as well, but I think the costs are probably further reduced and probably easier to keep updated as we move forward. I don't know how people feel about that.
So my first inclination is to believe that if Helm supports the things that CR-init was written, or kubefed was written to address that it did not support, it's pretty reasonable to get rid of the tool and move on to Helm charts. My concern is that I don't necessarily know how much, I don't know if having Helm charts creates extra, work to do for somebody who wants to just try it out. If installing, now they have to install Helm in their cluster and that as well, if that creates an extra burden for the sort of just try it and go case. if it's like, oh, now you have to do 7 other things before versus instead of running a command, that for me is a bit disconcerting. But I imagine this is a problem that other tools have solved in a reasonable way, since I know Helm is quite commonly used. So yeah, I think it's worth evaluating if it can actually replace the tool, because I agree, I don't really want to have to maintain a separate tool. I think it's unfortunate. It's a decent amount of extra work to have to keep that tool and test that tool. And it would be, I would definitely like to push that work onto mostly having Helm doing their testing and just writing a chart, which is declarative. Yeah, I think it's something we will have to look in more. And I noticed Paul said they have a PR to move the Helm onto the Helm functionality. I think when that's ready, definitely share it so we can evaluate it and look at it. I think for now, at the very least, I'd be potentially content to have both, at least in the early stages, to have both solutions out there, and then to make a more decided consideration later as to whether we want to say get rid of one or the other.
I think that when we were discussing this, the possibility that Helm does the SSL generation, but can't actually handle detection of the IP of a load balance service, that could be a blocker. I'm not sure if that's been considered.
Yeah, I haven't looked into this, so I'm not sure either. But that does sound like a reasonable blocker. And I know that Madhu said that was something that they had not been considering on their roadmap as something they would support, this kind of thing. But that
Yeah,
was
I think the salient question is probably whether we have to sign the certificates with the external load balancer IP. If we do, it's probably a non-starter right now.
Okay. I'm not sure. My inclination is that yes, we do have to, because the certificate has to, I believe the certificate does require that load balancer IP in order to set up the SSL connection correctly, but I'm not sure. I don't know that in enough detail to confidently say yes or no.
What is the root of trust for a Helm-generated TLS certificate? Because it seems like if you're just having Helm generate the certificates anyway, they're likely going to be invalid regardless, right? Like you'll have to insecurely connect to it and not verify it against the chain.
For those of you who can't see, Jonathan's taking down notes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I am not certain off the top of my head whether the Sprig library that Helm is using supports injecting your own CA to do the signing with. That's a really good question. I believe that the pull request and service catalog is just doing it's using a self-signed certificate, and then so for clarity, the problem space is a little simpler in service catalog, because we basically just have to generate certs that the API aggregator will then use to talk to Service Catalog API server. And in the API service resource that you create that the aggregator knows about, you can just put the CA bundle to use. If, for example, you have a self-signed certificate or you have you need to use a bundle that's not in the system trust store. So it seems like the problem space is a little simpler there. I don't know off the top of my head if you can inject your own CA to use, and probably there's scenarios where you have your own PKI that this wouldn't work with. So it's I think worth evaluating exactly what the capabilities are versus what's in CR in it. That's all.
Okay, so Paul, Ivan, are you guys looking into that? I don't really have any context here. Can you take that on to evaluate those capabilities and report back what you found?
Yeah, we have an existing issue that we have somebody looking at right now. It does seem like the external load balancer IP could be an issue, although Service Catalog uses the built-in Kubernetes DNS that gets deployed for that service, and that seems to be handling it appropriately. So perhaps we can just rely on the DNS capability there. And as far as providing your own certs, we could probably use variables as well, and you can pass those in and override kind of whatever the chart templates specify. So we'll look into it and report back.
Yeah, I think upon further consideration, since we last discussed this, I do think service catalog problem space is simpler because TLS terminates at the aggregator, and then like TLS between aggregator and service catalog API server terminates at the aggregator, and then you use your own TLS, like whatever TLS the aggregator uses for its serving certificate to talk to it. So potentially simpler problem space now that I'm thinking further about it.
Is this something that we should maybe send to a thread and start a discussion there so we can actually have the written word and make sure that we agree on what the problem is and have a good solution? This feels to me something that, somebody should maybe take the ownership and run down, in a written form.
Yeah, potentially, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I would like to be able to have this in written form so I can think about it a bit more concretely.
Jonathan, do you think you can drive this or start that thread in that conversation? And
yeah, so I'll send out a thread to the SIG and CCing relevant people later, sort of to kick off this discussion. I guess I can also do this in the PR. We can do this in an issue in the repository if people are okay with that. I think there already is an issue. I can assign that issue particularly to, I guess that issue is already assigned. No, I guess it's not assigned because of Kubernetes repository membership. I'll send out something to try and drive this.
Yeah, currently I have updated Paul and Ivan's name against this update in the notes, SIG notes.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so Ivan, you have something else you wanted to?
Yeah, I guess the last thing that we had kind of discussed, and Paul's actually added a question about it in the doc itself, is over vendoring dependencies, and if the plan is to vendor dependencies, and if so, is Bazel the way forward for that? Is that the plan?
So my initial working plan was to not check in vendor dependencies. Until I think I don't know what the requirements are for somebody who would necessarily be vendoring in the cluster registry. In my experience, it seems like having vendor dependencies checked in makes it more difficult for other things to vendor you in.
That's not true.
It's not true? Okay.
No, the vendoring, I mean, you use a good vendoring tool, like I'm using Glide. We're using Glide for Kubernetes Federation, and it's simply a matter of passing the right flag, and it'll strip the dependencies that have been vendored, and it will sort of re-vendor them at the root level and make sure that there's coherency across all of the things you're vendoring. So tool support for the win.
And also importantly, if you use something like Glide, if cluster registry uses something like Glide and has a manifest describing what the versions of its dependencies are, if you use Glide then to vendor in the cluster registry, you'll get all those same versions.
Oh, that's a good point. So I'm liking Bazel more than maybe I did in the past, but one of the challenges with going with Bazel only is it kind of forces everybody else to also use Bazel, and maybe somebody that wants to vendor cluster registry isn't going to be using Bazel as their primary mechanism.
But doesn't using Glide then force somebody to use Glide as well?
No, because I mean, all the vendoring tools basically have support for all the other vendoring tools. It's kind of the nature of the game. And I'm not sure that there's enough of I don't think Bazel is in widespread use that those vendoring tools are supporting Bazel first class yet.
Can I suggest that we just use this same mechanism that Kubernetes uses, whatever that may be,
No.
just to be kind of
Just because that's GoDeps, and the people behind APA machinery have said unequivocally that it's not a good choice if you're picking a tool. It's something that you use because you're already using it.
So
yeah, you know what? I think that at least Maru, is there anyone besides Maru who feels comfortable with understanding the state of the art in Kubernetes with vendoring and depths in general? Because I know that when I joined the group 2 years ago, it was complicated and I learned a lot about it, but I know things have really moved on since then. And I don't feel, at least, I don't think the Googlers, at least in the the multi-cluster team here, have a lot of deep expertise. Or do you, Jonathan? Or?
So I have been talking internally to the people who are in the I've been talking to Jeff and other people who deal with sort of API machinery and repository infrastructure. The impression I got was that the goal is I guess I have not explicitly asked about vendoring, so I think I can follow up with them. What I wanted to do was I wanted to not go with the current state of things. I wanted to figure out where they're trying to go and meet them there. So if I don't want to start with what they have now and then end up having to refactor it later to go to where they're trying to go, I wanted to see what their goal, their ideal state was and go based on that.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say earlier, but that you said much better now. That's what I think we should do.
Okay.
Yeah, and
so
I think, Jonathan, the original question that you were trying to ask or answer is, do you really want to vendor the dependencies in or not? That is what probably you need to answer first, right?
Yes, and I think one of the ways I want to answer that is to ask the people who are working on Kubernetes, sort of how Kubernetes depends on other code, whether they intend to continue to vendor in other things into the tree, or whether they intend to move to a mechanism where they're not depending on checked-in vendor dependencies.
So I can tell you a couple of things that are sort of ongoing. One is that this vendoring tools that we were talking about, they are transient. For example, Maru mentioned that currently the best solution or best choice across different repos is Glide, but maybe 6 months down the line or sometime in future it might not be the same. Also, because there are multiple repos and there is code being moved out or reorganized or whatever, there is a set of dependencies which most of the repos might want to depend on, which is common across multiple repos. That is not answered yet. And I have seen multiple open issues in Kubernetes itself which are trying to answer all these questions, but are all transient. So you have to answer for now what you want to do.
So not trying to solve the diamond problem and not trying to get too much into vendoring. I think as someone who needs to use or wants to use the cluster registry very soon, or at least the APIs, what is less contentious for me is that any generated stubs, any generated Go code, like non-vendored code that the cluster registry does create, need to be checked in. Because right now I think that you have to do all the client generation through Bazel. So that to me is a less contentious one. And then the argument about which vendoring manifest we should use is different.
So I specifically asked people working on Kubernetes, they have a goal to not check in any generated clients. I mean, their goal is to try to move towards Kubernetes not having generated checked-in code.
But that's aspirational.
Yeah.
And I would say that there is complication in the near term of following that. Like, I've had to jump through hoops to get OpenAPI code generated for vendored Kube because they decided not to check it in Kube, which is fine because it was causing lots of merge conflicts. But then if you're vendoring Kube, you need to be able to you have to have the same sort of mechanisms in place to generate vendored and non-vendored. Nobody has done that work for OpenAPI. I guarantee nobody's done that work for client gen because it's still generated in Kube. So I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm saying there'll be work involved to make sure that you can generate within cluster registries Bazel build and also enable that same code to be generated consistently from a project that's vendoring cluster registry. Anyway, just add it as a risk. I'm not saying it prevents you from taking whatever course you want. It's just something to consider.
Okay. No, that makes sense. I mean, I suppose depending on how people want to use it, it is reasonable to check in the generated code, and then when Kubernetes migrates off of checking in the generated code, to stop checking in the generated code.
I mean, you can not check it in. You just have to make sure that you can consistently generate it from a vendoring situation.
That makes sense, which is one of the things, yeah, which is one thing that Bazel itself is very good at, is consistently generating things.
It is, and so one of the things that we touched on, and Ivan and Paul, feel free to chime in, is Bazel's great as long as everything uses Bazel. And it's, in some ways, it's like it's a good thing because it has all kinds of advantages in terms of how it enables you to manage a dependency graph. But it means anyone who's consuming it is suddenly on the hook for using Bazel as well. And so it's kind of viral in the same way that like GPL is viral. And I don't think that the community as a whole has really considered the implication of that. It's just kind of being, because it's not the first class build system for KK yet, kind of in the process of becoming so. I think that we're going to have to consider that, like, we have some concern within Red Hat about being able to consume a project that uses Bazel build if internally the way that we build RPMs isn't compatible with Bazel build, at least not initially. And so that would mean that it would be putting, like, and anybody else who's consuming things with existing tooling and infrastructure that isn't necessarily immediately compatible with Bazel, it's going to impose a cost on our productizing. Paul, do you want to add to that?
Paul had to drop out, unfortunately.
Oh, crap. I think he had more concern than I did. I mean, I'm not necessarily, yeah. Anyway, so I mean, I guess it just raise it as a risk. And this is a larger issue, and it's not just like SIG multicluster or cluster registry. It's more like in general, as we move to Bazel, what are the implications for the consumer of the repos?
Yeah, we would need to do some investigation and check internally whether we can live with that.
Yeah, and I think we need to cut this discussion short. We have a couple of other items to talk. Probably go ahead. So,
Someone's typing that's not muted, and it's pretty audible.
yeah, I think whoever it was stopped. So, Jonathan, you want to share the notes once again? I mean, in place of the doc that you are sharing, or let me share. I just need to give an update about the progress on the move out of Federation move out. And there is one point I want to. There's one point I want to, raise help on, which is moving the issues. We have approximately some 160 plus issues which are against SIG Multicluster. So how exactly we trash them, move them to say the new repo Federation, and I believe none of them are against cluster registry. Am I right, Jonathan? I mean, you might be able to clearly say that. Hello. Am I audible or?
You are audible. Nobody else is talking now.
Okay. So yeah, one point was how to move those issues or how to handle those issues. They will live in Kubernetes core, or they need to be moved to a new repo, or how exactly do we do that? Some suggestions are welcome on that.
Yeah, I have a suggestion. So I think there's two separate issues here. One is the mechanics of exactly where these issues live. Right now, they live in the core repo, and presumably, logically, they should all be moved out. But then there is a somewhat orthogonal issue, which is, how do we actually approach these things? Like who works on them? How do we prioritize them, etc. And so I've done a fair bit towards the latter recently, in that I have taken all of the backlog and prioritized them and made sure that the assignments are sane. So I think that we should just continue with that, and then in parallel, figure out when and how to move them to the new repo. And I suggest that we just make that part of the repo move project. You guys have the understanding of why there. Do the mechanics that way.
There is automation to move the issues. For some reason, I thought that was already known.
No, I just wanted to know if somebody else has the same experience and they might have done something about that, or some prescription about that automation. I know about there are some projects which can move or duplicate the issues. And as Quinton mentioned, the other point that I wanted to clearly talk about the assignments. Like, I'm not sure if there is enough appearance or enough information today, but how many people are actually actively working on, we have currently 2 projects running within the SIG Multicluster, right? So how and who are currently involved with both the projects?
What's the question?
How many people are working and how many people can we expect? Like, this question was raised by Quinton a couple of weeks back or a couple of meetings back, like assignments from Red Hat, assignments from Huawei, and who we can expect will start working on this.
I think it's kind of, I don't know, I think we have to actually get it out of tree. That's kind of the blocker for active development. You can't really do anything. So once that happens and we restart development, then things will start happening. But until that happens, I think it's premature.
Yeah, I must be honest, I don't agree with that, Maru. I think there's, things like triaging the issues and reproducing bugs and doing things like that do not have to wait for code moves. And I really don't want us to bring the world to a halt until...
It's already at a halt, though. That's kind of my point.
No, it's at a halt because there's nobody else available to work on the stuff, which is different than we have, So there is nothing at the moment stopping people going through an issue, figuring out what the current status is, reproducing the bug if it's a bug, etc. And there's no reason why that cannot be done in parallel with finalizing the move of the repo. Other than the fact that we may not have enough people, or people may not actually be doing that, but I don't think that the repo move is a legitimate.
My point is that the active contributors right now are working on the repo move, both on your side and ours, other than cluster registry. So, there's 3 people currently. Once the cluster registry is out of tree, then there's bodies available to actually do other work.
Okay. So what I can say is we will defer this and maybe check again next meeting or next meeting onwards. And update about that move out is that we are almost there, and we should be able to probably cut over this week sometime. I have updated a short status in the notes, so if there are no questions on that, I don't really need to update further.
Specifically, code freeze was kind of unofficially on Friday. There hasn't been a lot of development. There's one DNS one that we're letting him continue to work and working with him to providing feedback, etc. Right now, there's PRs that are posted for KK and for some supporting repo, Cube OpenAPI, that I want to see merge before we cut over. They're what enabling us to generate OpenAPI out of tree. Once those merge, if the DNS PR is not merged, I'm just going to say he has to target the new repo. But then it'll be a matter of just doing the work to post the removal merge the removal PR, revendor, respin the PR for creating code in the new repo, and then we'll be go. So hopefully that will happen Thursday at the latest. And obviously once that's done, we can send an announcement to Kubernetes Dev and SIG Multicluster, so people know that it's happened. But no new code into the tree for Federation, and probably we'll just close all the existing PRs with notification as to what they actually need to take. So.
Yep, and I did actually trash those PRs also and notify those people last weekend. So they are well aware of what's going on. So if they can close it before we cut over, then it's good. Otherwise, those PRs can come to the new repo. Yep. So is there anything else that we want to discuss? I think we are almost 3-4 minutes over time also.
Hello, can you?
Oh. Yeah, that was like, yeah, we can hear you. Hello. Jonathan, now we can't hear you.
Hello?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Yeah.
Apologies. We're having some weird issues. We're having some issues on our side with our speaker phone, so we were not audible, I think, for the last 10 minutes.
Oh. Okay.
You asked earlier about cluster registry issues. I don't think there are any in K/K, but if there are, just send them my way, and I will figure out how to migrate them into the cluster registry repo specifically.
Oh, yeah, that is something like have to go through, figure out. So I'll appreciate if you want to just skim through those SIG multicluster issues and see if there is any which might be relevant.
Yeah, I'll skim through the SIG multicluster issues and see if there are any that are relevant. I don't expect there necessarily will be, but I will do that skim anyway.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Jonathan.
One other thing to report, at least on the testing end, is we did meet this week. At least a few of us, Madhu and I, have met with Test Infra, and they are going to adopt the Fed tidy tool that is required if you're on call rotation. That's essentially our janitor that cleans up in the projects what's left behind so that we don't hit quotas and such. And it has to be run periodically. Just it's a long discussion, but it took them a while to accept the tool, just because it had Go dependencies, and most of their tooling is not written in Go. But we ironed out some of the remaining issues, and we have a path forward. But the summary is they are owning the tool right now. It's in their repo, and we may revisit in the future whether it moves from their repository to our future repository. But for now, they're running the tool and they own the tool. And if it needs to be changed, we promised them that we would send them relevant PRs.
Very cool. I can't help but be curious what language they chose other than Go to write their tooling in.
Python, right?
Yeah, it's a mix of Shell and then Python.
Okay.
So like the tool needs the GC APIs to be vendored in. And I think there was concerns about how big the repo is, and they need or prefer the repo to be small. So when we essentially put on the table what everybody's preferences were and what really needed to be done, we came to an agreement.
Okay.
Cool. So I think in that case, I guess unless anybody has anything else, we can end 4 minutes early. I will send out, I have a few action items here to send out some notes and to follow up with some issues in the registry. And I will, I think, yeah, so I will follow up on those things.
Cool.
Okay. Yep. So see you guys next time.
Take care, everyone.
Bye bye.
Thanks all.
Thanks. Bye.